Good morning, everyone. Hello from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe and points beyond. My name is Scott Cullinane, and I am the Executive Director of the U.S.-Europe Alliance. For those of you not familiar with us, we are a bipartisan initiative dedicated to mobilizing Americans to advocate for the enduring transatlantic partnership. Before we get into today's topic, I'm happy to see that we have a number of people who are first-time audience members. And if you haven't already done so, let me encourage you to please stay connected with us by following us on social media at USE Alliance or by signing up for our email list at useurope.org. Before you turn to the conversation, I'd like to explain for a moment why we have arranged the conversation you're about to hear on the transatlantic relationship and in Sub-Saharan Africa. The goal of USEA is to work with a broad swath of Americans to ensure that the transatlantic relationship is understood and made fit for purpose in the 21st century because it is the best pathway for Americans to be more secure and more prosperous. And you'll notice I emphasize the forward-looking nature of that statement. As the world changes, the transatlantic relationship must grow, must change, must keep pace. And in that vein, the US-Europe Alliance has organized conversations around, in that context, what it means for the future relationship with China, what it means for the changing global economy. What does that mean for American youth who weren't alive and have no memory of the Cold War? So today's conversation about the future of Sub-Saharan Africa represents another crucial topic, which I think will become increasingly important for both the EU and the US as we go forward in the 21st century. Now, as I said before, I'm looking forward to learning a lot from our two speakers today in the conversation, and we are very fortunate to have a superb lineup. And to moderate the conversation, we have Desiree Cormier-Smith, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Africa, Europe, and Eurasia with the Open Society Foundations here in Washington. Previously, she was the Senior Director for the Africa portfolio with Albright Stonebridge, and before that, a Foreign Service Officer with the US State Department. So eminently qualified to talk about today's topics. And before I turn it over to her, let me just say to the audience members, we welcome questions. And if you wouldn't mind, as they occur to you, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be collecting those, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. And so with that, I'll say thank you. And Desiree, please take it away.
Thank you, Scott. It's my pleasure to be with you all this morning to discuss the U.S. perspective on the U.S.-EU transatlantic cooperation on issues of mutual concern in Sub-Saharan Africa. As Scott said, my name is Desiree Cormier-Smith, and I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Africa, Europe, and Eurasia for the Open Society Foundations. The African continent represents the youngest region in the world. Before the coronavirus pandemic, 5 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. As many of the world's traditional superpowers move towards isolationism, Africa is moving towards greater regional integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA agreement, will create the largest free trade area in the world measured by the number of countries participating. The pact connects 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. It has the potential to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty. With 54 votes in the United Nations, representing 28% of UN members, the Africa Group is the largest regional group by number of member states. The Africa Group also has 3 non-permanent seats on the Security Council. Given its economic potential, the security challenges within its borders that could have global implications, and the increasing role that the Africa bloc and individual African states play on the global stage, suffice it to say that Africa matters to the US and the EU, or at least it should. Historically, Africa has not figured high on the priority list of US or EU foreign policy. But given that the US and EU generally have shared priorities in Africa, particularly in the economic and security sectors, it offers an opportunity for greater transatlantic cooperation and coordination with African partners. I'm hoping our panelists can help us understand if that cooperation is indeed happening, and if so, whether there's the potential to expand it to other areas, and if not, why not? I'm honored to be here this morning with two experts who are particularly well suited to speak to today's topic from the US perspective, Dr. Misha Thompson and Lars Benson. Dr. Misha Thompson is the Director of Global Partnerships, Policy and Innovation at the US Helsinki Commission. For those unfamiliar, the US Helsinki Commission is an independent US government agency created by Congress in 1975 to monitor compliance with the Helsinki Final Act and other OSCE commitments. She also advises the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Special Representative on anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance, and commissioners on security and human rights issues related to diverse populations. Prior to joining the commission, she served as a professional staff member on the US Senate's Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. Lars Benson is the Regional Director for Africa at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, in Washington, D.C. He works closely with partners representing the private sector, civil society, and government to implement policy and regulatory reforms, anti-corruption initiatives, engage in public-private dialogue, and improve democratic governance across the continent. Prior to joining CIPE, Lars served as the country director assisting small and medium enterprises to provide services and products to the oil industry in Angola. Misha and Lars, thank you both for joining us this morning. This is a big topic, and I know we only have an hour with you, so I'm going to dive right in. My first question to the both of you is to help set the scene for us. I'll start with Misha. Misha, how would you characterize the current status of the EU-US relationship? You're still on mute.
Of course, that popped up as soon as, so I was going to say everything is all sunshine and roses. So it is the ideal relationship, I would say, other than, I would say, a few minor issues. I would say some of the first that I'll list are actually really COVID related. So for instance, when travel restrictions started around countries, the US was concerned about possibly bringing COVID into the country. The EU was actually raised as some of the entities that were of concern, and travel bans were actually put in place without consultations with the EU. At the same time, the United Kingdom was exempt at the time. And then that is actually on top of some things that happened earlier where the current administration actually backed more or less Brexit. So the UK leaving the European Union, which some viewed as a way that the United States was actually contributing to the EU bloc actually becoming undone. You had the United States actually pull out of the Paris climate agreements, work to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, things that the Europeans or EU bloc had really been staunch supporters of and worked very closely with the previous administration on. There were still and other tariffs that were placed on EU companies. So there's kind of this list of, I would say from the EU perspective, of changes that were happening between the United States and the European relationship in terms of policy in a very short period of time. I think one that were unexpected, two that weren't done, I would say, through some of the normal, I think, means of negotiations that changed the relationship from, in a sense, how it had been, I would say, previously viewed over the past few decades in terms of the United States actually viewing the EU as one of our top trade partners, one of our top partners in terms of larger security issues in the region and the world, in terms of one of our, I would say, top partners, really in terms of ideas around democracy, human rights, good governance, et cetera. So I will say the short maybe term for all of this is our relationship is currently in flux. And I think we will kind of see what direction we are going to be heading in a few weeks following November elections.
Thank you. Lars, how would you describe the current state of U.S.-Africa affairs?
Thank you, Desiree. I actually prepared some remarks, and if it's okay, I'll start that off because I think it frames your question quite well. So I'd like to thank the US-Europe Alliance for hosting this webinar. It is a pleasure to share the platform with Dr. Misha Thompson, Desiree Cormier-Smith, and Scott Cullinan. The purpose, of this webinar is to discuss how US, Europe, and Africa can build stronger ties and strategic partnerships. In a world where we see traditional alliances frayed, a rising tide of authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, rising inequality, and questions about the validity of market economic systems, it is time to push back and reinforce the call for democratic renewal and renewed faith in transforming markets. Business, government, and civil society will have to work together if a prosperous and a democratic society is to be sustained. As the Regional Director for Africa, I'm here today representing SIPE. SIPE is the leader in providing workable business and private sector-led solutions to the challenges of economic and democratic development. We learned a long time ago that economic well-being is at the heart of a stable society, and that real and sustainable prosperity can only be achieved if private enterprise is encouraged and enabled. Across Africa and elsewhere in the world, we have seen a growing and dangerous misperception that democracy doesn't work, that market economies are failing, and that violent extremism is just around the corner. When we take a closer look, however, we see the real villains: weak governance, low economic growth. And the cause of these conditions is known to everyone: increasing corruption, flawed elections, limited educational opportunities, and fake economic solutions, which lead directly to growing inequality between the rich and poor, men and women, and unequal growth across different geographic areas. Although market capitalism and global trade has substantially reduced worldwide poverty, too many citizens believe that new economic opportunities are not shared equitably, that the benefits are only for a few, and worst of all, that the situation can only be corrected through violence and social upheaval. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read Scott Cullinan's article in The Hill entitled, "Could Sub-Saharan Africa Be What Unites US and Europe?" In it, he suggests that Africa could be, quote, "a strategic project where the skill sets and the political interests of both the US and Europe can complement one another to achieve a mutual interest." That could be achieved by cooperating in Sub-Saharan Africa to expand market-oriented economies and democratic governance. Democratic values are the glue that bonds citizens together in Africa, US, and Europe, and includes a desire for rule of law, good governance, accountability and transparency, separation of powers, and civil society participation. US and European foreign policy should be based on strengthening democratic values across Africa. Some might argue that this is part of the US and European foreign policy, but I would argue that a lot more needs to be done. Such a foreign policy approach would not only be welcomed by Africans, but it would also distinguish US and Europe from other autocratic countries. It would be good for building commercial ties between Africa and Western democracies. Business is about trust. Customers want high quality, affordable products. Suppliers need consistent policies and the rule of law to ensure that payments are received. Foreign and domestic investors require returns on investment and minimal corruption environments. Democracy provides ingredients for economic growth and opportunity. Who better to advocate for democratic values than Europe and the United States? This would ensure increased trade between Africa and others and build new ties that bring Africa, US, and Europe closer together. Building relationships around democratic values is both sustainable over the long term and is a comparative advantage that speaks to the strength of the US and Europe and distinguishes us from others. Thank you for this opportunity. Now, to specifically answer your question, on how I would describe this current state of US-Africa affairs, I would couch it in one word, which is promising. In the past couple of years, we've seen significant changes both on the continent and in the United States. The BUILD Act specifically established the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which now has about $75 billion to provide equity financing, debt financing, political risk insurance, and to conduct feasibility studies. And so far, a bit has been invested in Africa. The second big initiative is the Prosper Africa Initiative. This is a whole of government approach to private sector led and demand driven to increase two-way trade and investment between the United States and Africa. This initiative claims to or aims to counter the influence of Chinese and other competitors on the African continent. And you know, the Chinese in particular are rapidly expanding trading relationships across each individual countries in the continent. In 2015, China exported to Africa about 5-6 times more than the US. The next big that I think could be a game changer, and you mentioned, Desiree, is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And what we need to really talk about here is one of the limitations across economic growth and development in Africa has really been about intra-African trade. And what AFTA promises to do is to potentially increase trade by 50 to 53% by eliminating import duties. This has the potential to double if we also consider reducing non-tariff barriers. Finally, we also have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC, and it continues to make major investments in African countries that are committed to reform and good governance. Around 70% of MCC's investments are in Africa, with about $3 billion in active compacts and another 1.8 billion in the pipeline. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. I know you touched on this a bit, but would love to hear your and Misha's thoughts on the policy priorities for the EU and the US in Sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, to what extent do they align and where do they differ? Misha, do you mind starting for the EU?
So I would say on the surface, we would say that the policies pretty much, they align. The focus has really been around democracy and human rights and good governance, around peace and security, and really around growth and development. And most, I would say recently, primarily for Europe, it's been around migration and more or less youth development. So on paper and on, the surface, you would probably say, hey, this sounds a lot like what the United States is also, trying to do. And I'll let Lars talk a little bit more about that. But what I will say is if you dig a little bit beneath the surface, you realize that these are some of the policies that are on paper. Starting in 2015, the EU in particular started to add a lot more money to its more, I would say, for African countries, really around issues around migration. So upwards at that time of close to $2 billion. Since that time, we're reaching close to about $15 billion in terms of different forms of programs and investment that Europe has in Africa. And the tone and tenor of those relationships has also changed over time. And so now you'll hear a lot coming from the EU as it's going to be a relationship that's based upon more or less like an equal partnership. And so the sense that we are now seeing Africans as equals, that is not necessarily what was happening before. And so that's why I say, if you kind of look on the surface, you'll see, the kind of 4 or 5 bullet points that sound as if this is relationship that is exactly, I think, what Lars just articulated in terms of what the US policy would be. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we do realize there is a large component that really focuses around migration. And when I say migration, part of that is having African populations that are more or less low skilled actually remain in Africa while also trying to help develop talent, resources, and others that would be valuable for Europe. So whether that's in trade or whether that's through high-skilled African workers that could then come to Europe.
Lars?
Thank you. I also would agree with Misha in that there is a lot more alignment than there is specifically some differences. And, you know, if we start to take a look at perhaps where there might be some of the differences is that the EU relationship with Africa has really focused a lot more until recently than the United States on sort of that economic growth and development in terms of the trading partnerships. This might be going back to, you know, strong historical ties, and the fact is that both Africa and Europe have and have had always strong trading relationships between the two countries. But overall, I mean, I would also definitely agree with Misha in terms of the priorities that are mostly focused in some ways around democratic development, peace and security, and that angle of economic development and economic growth.
Great. Now, given that we are a little over 2 weeks from our own election here in the United States, I would like to hear your perspectives on how you anticipate these relationships and priorities changing, if at all, under a second Trump administration or under a Biden administration. Misha, can I start with you?
And so, see, I was going to defer to Lars to start on that one, but what I will. So I'll kind of say a couple of things on this. So in another life, I actually worked on U.S. Africa policy, and so I'll say kind of from a long range, more institutional view, the United States has not had as large of an investment in Africa generally in comparison to some other parts of the world. And so what you've seen under different administrations is a different focus on different things. So a lot of people know, for example, under the Bush administration, there was a large focus on AIDS or PEPFAR relief. There were just things under the Obama administration. There was an attempt to actually meet with heads of states and visit different countries and in a sense develop other relationships with leaders. But if you were to actually look kind of at the amount that has been invested, it does not necessarily compare to our investments in other parts of the world. I would say additionally, we haven't also been able to, I think, secure some of the same types of relationships that Europeans have had, in part just because a number of European countries that are currently in Africa are also either former colonial powers and or have other relationships that have developed over time. So what that actually means is if you're in a country, for example, that is a former French colony or UK colony, et cetera, it also means possibly land is still owned by persons in the former colonial power. You have different services and other things that are still really kind of on that system. So whether that's electrical outlets, whether it's the use of centimeters versus inches, whether it's language, there are just a number of other factors that really do contribute to, in some cases, Europeans actually having stronger relationships in some countries than the United States. And so then the United States then has, in a sense, that barrier to actually overcome to improve relationships with Europe, in addition to other players such as China that have been mentioned earlier. So that being said, as we move forward, depending on which way the administrations go, if you more or less look at the plan for the current administration, it's a plan that talks a lot about investment, trade, other things. But the reality is there are other players that are already there. And there are other players in some cases that are offering, I would say, deals and opportunities for trade and investment that don't require, I would say, some of the bureaucratic, either paperwork or other things that our nation has traditionally required. And the sense is some of that would actually be the same, whether it's a Biden or a Trump administration, in the sense that more or less the US is more playing catch up to relationships that Europeans have really had for a very long time, but also the injection of money that I said earlier, that's probably tantamount to close to like $13 billion. That's already there. That's coming from the Europeans. So I would say either way, I think there are some opportunities for both administrations. So whoever comes into power to make some strides in Africa, but it's definitely not going to be easy because we're more or less, I would say, decades behind.
Thanks. And how do you see any changes in the US-EU relationship under either a second Trump administration or under a Biden administration?
So I think, so I'll just say from listening to a number of experts, speaking to European colleagues and friends, the assumption is that if we continue with the current administration, that it will more or less be the current business that we see on the table. So there will be a continuation to try to form trade relationships, I think, with individual entities, an attempt to try to build a stronger relationship, for example, with the UK, who's already on its way out of the EU, a continual effort to maybe downgrade relationships with Germany, a continuing positioning of Europe as a competitor, as a way to actually increase negotiations around trade and other initiatives. There will be, I think, a continued attempt to try to see if there are some points of synergy to work with Europe, particularly around China. And if you actually look at some of Secretary Pompeo's more recent speeches related to Europe, it really is about how Europe, sorry, not Europe, but the EU might be able to work with the United States around somehow creating some barriers to increased Chinese business, technology, and other encroachment in Europe and the United States and pretty much around the rest of the world. I think the thinking is if there's a Biden administration, the hope that I think a lot of people are projecting is that there will be a return to the traditional US-EU relationship. There are some that are saying that that is not going to be possible, that there's a lot of ground that has been lost in the sense of the role that the United States had traditionally had around European security, in part because you now have France, Germany, and others really talking about how Europe can, beef up its own forces, et cetera. And so I think there's a real, I think there would be an intent by a Biden administration to try to return to more or less what we would have called business as usual. However, it might not be quite that easy.
Thank you. Lars, can you talk about the potential for change, if any, under a second Trump administration or a new Biden administration for Africa?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'll agree with Misha in terms of how she framed the relationship. I think under another Trump administration, we will see the continuation of some of the important programs and initiatives that have started, including Prosper Africa. And I believe, we will continue to see MCC, and we will continue to see efforts and energy about building increased trade ties between the US and Africa. What we also need to understand, and this was touched upon, is that Trump administration has framed the relationship with Africa under sort of the premise of US-China. And so when we take a look at the different initiatives and the public speeches by different members of the administration, we see a lot of conversation around how potentially we can compete with China in terms of Africa, and China, again, through their Belt and Road Initiative, through several long years of quite substantial investments, through a large presence in terms of number of firms on the continent, have continued to build those commercial relationships across the continent. And America, in some ways, in the United States, is playing catch up in terms of trying to find new ways and new initiatives in terms of trying to promote US-Africa growth. And I believe that ACFA, as it comes into effect at the beginning of next year, is going to offer at least a renewed look at the continent. With regards to the Biden administration, there really hasn't been too much out there, but he has suggested in comments that he's going to, with Africa, prioritize economic growth, empower women, and build upon the partnerships and urbanization and health opportunities in Africa. But really, Africa has not figured prominently within the campaign up until now. Either way, a Trump or Biden administration will continue to really focus on building trade or building trade and investment between the United States and Africa. And I don't see that changing under any administration. What the devil is going to be in the details. And so the question is not really for large US multinationals or other large US firms, but really the question is, how do we spur interest and increase partnerships between small and medium US firms, as well as the growing medium-sized firms across the continent? And this is something that the administration is grappling with right now under Prosper Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to deviate from my list of questions and take a question from the audience because it picks up on something, on a theme you were talking about earlier, Lars, which I think is an important one, and that's democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism. And that's not something we're only seeing in Africa, but I think is an issue in Africa. But we're also seeing it in parts of Europe, like Hungary and Poland, and also, frankly, here in the United States, let's be honest. So the question from the audience member is, how do you both see this trend going in the next 5 years? Do you think it will continue? Will we see more of this? Or do you think this is just a blip and that we'll go back to the sort of rise of democracy? Lars, do you want to start?
Sure. So a few years ago, when we were talking and thinking about really the two main challenges that we felt was recurring on the continent, and the fact that, Africa makes one step forward and three steps back, or African countries sometimes make one step forward and three steps back, it really comes down to two main issues. The first one is democratic governance. And democratic governance is about really, again, as I mentioned, civil society, business, and the government working together to try to solve immediate problems. And right now, what we find is that state capacity across the continent is limited for many reasons. One of them is their ability to collect taxes. One is their very bureaucratic structures. One is the lack of transparency and accountability, which is really seen across many different countries in Africa. So what can we do to try to strengthen those issues? And it goes down to, going back to what I said earlier, it goes really back to democratic values and how do you bring really the private sector, business, and government together in terms of trying to solve immediate problems, whether they might be COVID-19 or others. So on that front, it's a challenge of democratic governance that we've seen across the continent, and that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. The second big challenge I think that we see across the continent is the issue of corruption. And this is where particularly the US and Europe can play a very positive role in terms of trying to shape perceptions of corruption on the continent. So in terms of free markets or a level playing field, you need to do away with a lot of the petty and institutional corruption that exists. And African countries have really passed fantastic laws, anti-corruption laws on the continent, but it hasn't really worked, and it's a failure of implementation. And it's typically trying to address corruption from the demand side. Well, SIPE is really working on the continent to try to address this from the supply side. So how can we get businesses more actively involved? And this goes to my second point. If business becomes more actively involved, why? Because it's in their own self-interest. It makes them more profitable. It also makes them more competitive. But it's also good for foreign and domestic investors. It's also good for Western democracy companies in Europe and the United States in terms of creating an environment that is attractive to invest and gives long-term stability. And so if we approach this from and you always have, if we talk about where most of the money comes in terms of paying for corruption, it comes from business. So this is not something that business voluntarily does because they feel they have to do this if they're going to play in a market. And so what is necessary is trying to change that dynamic and trying to change that. And that's something in terms of making Africa more competitive and also more attractive to US and European companies is an area where everyone can do a lot more of in terms of limiting that effect.
So it's interesting as I thought back to the question, which really talked kind of about authoritarianism and democracy. And if we think back over the past few years, and a number of European countries, they've just gone through a lot of political shifts. So real efforts to move away from more or less traditional parties. And we can talk about Italy, we can talk about Germany, we can talk about Spain, Austria, France. But really, what we're seeing a number of places are that some of the traditional parties aren't as strong as they used to be. People moving either to the right or the left. We're seeing people who are traditional players move into different parties. We're seeing elections being held more often. And so I think there is really all this also a question of more or less what you could call democratic stability in Europe. If people are, constantly shifting parties, if the power balances are changing, et cetera. And then that becomes relevant for two reasons. One, I would say both Europe and the United States have modeled themselves more or less as kind of the Western democracies and that a lot of the world should be aspiring to. So whether that's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Asia, et cetera. And so one, that question of what our new, what the models are. So what it is, a strong democratic nation should be looking like in the 21st century. I wouldn't say is necessarily a question because I think a lot of countries understand, what that, really should mean, rule of law, good governance, strong and fair markets. However, it suggests to them that they don't necessarily have to follow those rules, I think, as strictly as before, and that there are some real carve outs around that as long as you're I think checking some of the boxes in some way. So I think you kind of have that piece going on in terms of what type of behavior is supposed to be modeled right now. So what are kind of the democratic values? But I think the second piece is if you constantly have change in European structures, are they going to be able to do business? So for example, we saw in Italy, there was a real flip around migration issues between some of the different parties that came into play, where one leader was pretty much saying, we don't want any migrants from Africa. We, need to put pretty much a fence up. And then another political party coming in pretty much shortly after, so really through a loss of power, and saying, actually, we've had relations with the continent for a really long time. We're on the coast. We can really try to figure out how to work on integration and inclusion. Yes, we need to come up with a better path for migration, but this idea that we simply need to put up a fence or a wall is not necessarily the way forward. And so then the question is, so where does funding go? So was the funding that might have been used for development and growth now put into security? Is that flipping back and forth? And so if you kind of have these shifts taking place in Europe and a number, I would say, of countries that have either traditionally had these relationships or are looking to grow them or we're looking to help to stabilize, relationships with Africa, then that really, these kind of leadership issues are going to, become a problem long term. It also kind of suggests that even as, Africa is considering now that it's going to pretty much start to look more towards, how we can begin to work better with ourselves, how we can support ourselves, because the support from outside isn't necessarily coming in the way that it traditionally has.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I just want to, before I ask my next question to you both, I'd like to encourage audience members who have questions to go ahead and put them in the chat box. We have a little bit less than 20 minutes with our panelists, so now's the time to get your question answered if you'd like. Misha, I have a question for you, and Lars, of course, feel free to jump in if you'd like to weigh in. After the horrific murder of George Floyd this summer, we've seen massive protests and a long overdue reckoning with systemic racism and racial injustice, particularly in policing across the United States and in parts of Europe. Now in Nigeria, young people have mobilized in the streets and on social media against police brutality. To what extent, if any, do you see these movements as interconnected? Do you think they offer an opportunity for increased people-to-people collaboration across the US, Europe, and Africa?
So the movements are definitely interconnected for a number of reasons. And yes, they not only offer increased opportunities for connections, but they are already taking place. Nigeria is interesting in part because it's part of the block of countries that actually helped to call for the United Nations to focus on systematic racism, uh, and pretty much called for the High Commissioner to have a report that the UN will be considering in 2021 on where countries are in terms of addressing systematic racism with a focus on police abuse. And the report specifically mentioned the situation of George Floyd. So there will be a focus on the United States. And so the 54 block in the United Nations, actually with the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and then the support of the NAACP, Black Lives Matters movement, and others, actually really pushed for the UN to move forward on that. But we also saw comments from the African Union. There were conversations and debates within the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which we monitor. The European Union also adopted a George Floyd resolution and on September 22nd, so 3 days after the EU actually came out with its first anti-racism plan of action that is supposed to help to set a model for its 27 member states. We, as in the Helsinki Commission, were able to partner in cooperation with the European Parliament to actually hold a joint meeting that focused specifically on this issue in terms of how the United States and Europe could actually work together. So I think we're, in a sense, already seeing all of the connections with Africans actually kind of taking the lead in the UN. So there are no African countries that are part of the OSCE. We have Mediterranean partners, but they're primarily North African countries. So that's why I'm just highlighting kind of all of these different entities that have had some role in terms of pushing things forward. I think one of the things that's really important about some of the conversation that's come out of Nigeria in particular has been that some of their own citizens have been subject to police abuse in the United States. And so that's also part of the movement. But there's also been a really long history of African citizens that are living or working in Europe and or their descendants. So if they're second, third generation, et cetera, but being the victims of hate crimes, police violence, and others in Europe. And then the embassies actually raising those issues and not necessarily getting, I think, the type of response that they would expect from their European partners. So I would say this is a moment in time where we are, I think, not only seeing a large focus on these issues, but I think a real push for change and a push for change that actually moves beyond just policing, but to all sectors of society where there have been either historic I would say, disparities, where there's been direct discrimination, where there's honestly just been either prejudice or even talking about historical institutions where just the history, role, and contributions of the continent have been left out. So whether that's contributions to Europe or elsewhere, but all of these things are now officially on the table in a way that we haven't seen in recent times.
Thank you. Lars, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I would like to sort of share two thoughts on this. The first one is that absolutely, I see this as an opportunity to build relationships, especially among civil society groups and activists across Africa and the United States and even in Europe. You know, we're also talking about, using the Nigeria example, I mean, we're talking about police brutality. And if we sit here and we take a look at surveys that have been conducted over the past couple of decades in terms of different countries, you know, usually the number one government agency that that people protest about, it is the police. Both in terms of their human rights abuses, or the fact about the rule of law not being upheld, or the fact of really institutional corruption. And so I think what we're seeing in Nigeria offers us some hope that perhaps we can begin to see some reforms take place across the continent, especially as it relates to policing. Now, you know, I also want to suggest that you know, we're talking about social issues here. And while there are some similarities between the United States and perhaps what's happening in Nigeria, I think coming back to one of your earlier points, we got to remember that there are 54 countries in Africa, and each of them have different types of situations. And I think this is what we're talking about, is not necessarily going to be solved by multilateral organizations or institutions. This is going to truly be solved by grassroots civil society organizations in each of these different countries that, going back to democratic values, are able to hold and demand transparency and accountability from the police and other institutions. And I would argue that's also the case here in the United States.
Thank you. This is something you mentioned earlier, the growing influence of other actors in Africa. When COVID hit Africa, the continent's traditional partners, the US and the EU, were busy grappling with the pandemic within their own borders. China stepped up and provided medical resources and technical assistance. Do you think this is reflective of the growing influence of actors like China and Russia on the continent? And should this matter to the US and the EU? Whoever wants to start can go ahead and jump in.
Sure, I think so that that any country steps up to deal with a health crisis like COVID-19, I think is to be commended. One of the criticisms that I might potentially have is I don't think that the United States does a good enough job really talking about what we do with regards to healthcare in Africa, but also what we do in terms of humanitarian assistance. And while this information is publicly available, I don't really think that there is, we're really raising awareness or sharing that information with a lot of citizens. And I believe that the United States, you know, did step up even when we were facing our own pandemic and pledged and committed over $11 billion to address the pandemic abroad. And specifically with regards to Africa, the USAID was able in a short period of time to actually provide over $1 billion in foreign assistance, specifically to address COVID. And an additional $4 billion came from the private sector and private companies, US private companies, nonprofits, charities, et cetera. So there was, you know, an immediate response and reaction. And it goes back to perhaps trying to frame everything with regards to this, this competition between China and the United States, and what I think is the important thing here is that China did perhaps a better job initially in terms of both providing PPE equipment and some of the other different things. And they did a much better public relations campaign in terms of that. However, China, if you've been looking at some of the media reports in Africa, I mean, China has also been criticized in terms of the quality of some of the materials that they provided. There's been huge concerns about the increase in corruption, specifically as it related to some of these things that China was providing. And finally, you know, China didn't necessarily give a lot of this humanitarian assistance to address COVID for free. They actually was given as part of loans. And so eventually that means that they're expecting to get paid back for some of these equipments and other things that they donated. Of course, you know, China as well did donate materials, but I think that that's frequently not talked about when we're trying to frame this as it relates to COVID.
Misha?
Oh, I'll just say quickly, China has been in Africa over a decade. So I think this idea that China somehow building some new relationship with Africa that it didn't previously have is not necessarily true. They're kind of building on a relationship that they already had, whether it's perfect or imperfect. I think there's some kind of other issues at play if the U.S. really does want to take a lead. I do think there were also some concerns from Africa about the use of malaria drugs and this idea that they would not necessarily be available to Africa if, for example, this was found to be helpful with COVID, but that Western nations were going to have all of those drugs, for example. And then I think with some of the US's approaches to the head of the World Health Organization, but through this lens that he is also an African. Some of the tones, I think, weren't viewed on the continent as respectful, I think, as the relationship has been in the past, are some of the things that I think have really hurt the US around the COVID response. I think despite some of the aid that it's provided. And then I think the only other piece I'll add to this is really this idea that for a long time, the United States has really been a place where African youth had, looked to come for education and other opportunities. And with, I think, some of the changes around how migrants are being talked about and viewed here, there are these efforts, I think, for them to look for education elsewhere. And this is also another area in which Europe has had a head start for a very, very long time, in the sense that persons from former colonies have traditionally received higher education in Europe. And then there are also just many other trainings for diplomatic corps, other services that, just annually take place in Europe with persons from Africa. So I think all of these things are, really, I think, kind of factors not only around the COVID response, but also going forward.
Thank you. And before I give you both a chance to offer any final thoughts, I want to squeeze in one more question from the audience. The question is, will your assertions be any different if we begin to look at Africa as a country or as a single bloc as it moves towards achieving this goal of becoming a bloc with a single currency in the near future? Misha, do you want to start?
That was when I was going to let Laura start. Let me think on that one for a little bit. We'll let Laura.
Lars, go ahead.
Look, when we talk about economic integration, a single currency could be helpful. I think the single currency idea, though not based on and historically hasn't proven to be tremendously successful. If we look at the franc in West Africa and elsewhere, I mean, the reality is that that Africa is primarily a US dollar, euro based system. So I don't think that's really the important factor. I think the important factor is ACFA. I think if we take a look at what the Continental Free Trade Agreement promises, we're talking about increasing inter-African trade. And, frankly, we can't really be speaking about US and European investment in Africa until we find solutions, or Africans find solutions in terms of boosting trade between their countries. That has so much more promise in terms of providing jobs and economic growth to the continent. ACFA promises, but ACFA is a government-to-government type of agreement in terms of creating a free trade zone across the continent, and its promise is very positive. But there's a lot of the trouble is in the details here. And so what does this really mean? How are we going to reduce barriers to trade in between African countries? What does this mean with the whole regulatory and policy sort of framework that needs to be reformed? I mean, through the regional economic RECs, as they're called, we do know that Africa has made parts of Africa make progress towards trying to integrate their economies, but at the same time, there's a huge set of challenges. And so when we take a look at ACFA, it's really about speaking to African businesses and saying, this is potentially what ACFA means for you, but it's also talking to them and informing them about what ACFA means, but also getting their input in terms of helping to shape some of these new regulations that are going to have to come into play, and having time for businesses to get prepared, both small and medium businesses, but also manufacturers as well. And so overall, we're all for creating free trade, and we're all for boosting inter-African growth and trade between African countries, and that will, I think, naturally attract foreign and domestic investors and businesses wanting to expand their footprint across the continent.
So, and I'll answer this, but I think I'll also try to put in some of my closing remarks at the same time, just since we're close
Perfect.
to
You read my mind.
So, and I'll just say, I think generally what Africa, and I'll talk about this more from the perspective of African countries, but also based upon one of the meetings that we had with African ambassadors the last time that I was in Brussels, and what we heard directly from their mouths were really this idea that Africa wants to start to have newer relationships, whether it's with Europe, whether it's with the United States, that are really based upon mutual respect and as equal partners at the table. And for a number of different reasons, they don't feel as if that is what is going on now. That includes everything, I think, from whether or not they're even having the same level meetings as some other countries around trade and development issues. So are you getting, the meeting with the desk officer? Or are you getting the meeting with the assistant secretary? Are you, treated in a hospitable manner when you come here? Are you having to experience racism and discrimination? What is the response to that when you do have those types of really horrible experiences? Are you stopped at the border? We have a number of situations where people have either gotten stuck at the borders of Europe or stuck at the borders of the United States. And the only explanation really seems to be color, ethnicity, or because you have an African passport. And so all of those things, we've had officials who've had to cancel meetings because they're literally stuck at the border. So all of those things are really going to make a difference going forward, in addition to, I think, some of the larger, issues. So whether or not you have a single currency, whether or not the trade borders are open, whether or not you're able to be the first one when some type of new mineral resources is built, whether or not you're competing with China. I think those are some very kind of basic things that we've heard firsthand can really assist in changing I think the relationship um, and moving things forward. And then I think the last piece that is primarily just related to the European Union is really you're starting to see messages. So there have been messages that came out that, for example, 13% of the workers that are needed right now are actually people who are coming from Africa and other places, in part because so whether they're in the health profession, whether they're in some of the other professions, but I think there's this also greater realization that Africa has a wealth of resources in terms of just brilliant and or specifically skilled talent that is going to be needed not only in Europe, but the rest of the world. And so you're starting to see, I think, Europe actually pivot more towards that. There was a reduction in terms of requirements around status during COVID in a number of places, in part related to this realization. And I will say I have like 50 other things I would love to say, but we have to close. And so Scott, I just want to thank you for allowing us to be here and just say that I am happy to help continue the conversation either on or offline at a future date. And thank you, Desiree, as well.
Thank you, Misha. Lars, do you have any last thoughts quickly?
No, I think it comes back to, something you touched on in the beginning. When we talk about problems facing different African countries, it's going to be the people and the governments of those countries solving their own problems. The relationship between the United States and Europe with Africa, I think, is one that will increasingly be growing. Part of the reason will be the potential that Africa provides, both as a market, but also to receive not only goods and services, but also talent. And we have already seen this growing trend in terms of the continent and the opportunities that Africa provides. And I think what we need to think about in terms of moving forward is how to frame the conversation more about, if we have African countries that have strong democratic governments that are accountable and transparent, and we reduce corruption, this is going to not only help Africans, this is going to help the United States and European companies trying to do business in Africa. But it's not going to be US and Europe solving those problems. We can shape our policies and frame the conversation with Africa, one based upon mutual trust and respect, but also one based upon where we hold these democratic values to be the highest standard, and one that will be able to separate and distinguish sort of the growing Africa, US and Europe relationship moving forward. I also want to thank Scott and Desiree, yourself, for being such a great moderator, and it's been fascinating to as well be able to hear and the insights of Dr. Thompson. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Lars, and thank you, Misha, for your insights this morning. I thought it was an engaging and productive discussion. So Scott, thanks for having us. I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Desiree, Lars, Misha. This has been really fantastic and it exceeded even my expectations. So I'll just say, I think this is a great start for a conversation that we at US-Europe Alliance will continue to have. And before I say goodbye, let me just recognize Brittany Bellew. Thank you so much also for your help in organizing this event. It wouldn't have happened without you. And with that, I will say thank you. And everyone, enjoy your Friday, enjoy your weekend, and take care.